Okay, so I'm just going to talk through the correction of errors in your chapter there for financial accounting. So generally, when we get to the trial balance, we hope that it's clean of all errors, and you'll see in this example here, my debit and credit are balanced there at 288,000 on either side, and generally we'd be happy at that, but however that doesn't mean that the bookkeeping is error free. There may be errors within that even though it's balancing. So just have a look at some errors that are not revealed by the trial balance. So errors of omission, where I've left something out completely and I haven't included any debit or credit for it, that won't be revealed in the trial balance. An error of principle is where I have done a debit and credit but I have put them maybe into the wrong class of account. So for example, I might have put something through as a sale rather than an asset. Error of commission is where I've used the correct class of account but I've used the wrong account. So for example, if I have posted the purchase of a vehicle into the purchase of premises, it's still in the fixed assets account but it won't be revealed by the trial balance. Errors of original entry is where I've used the wrong figure in the day book and therefore it has carried through into the wrong figure on both the debit and credit in the ledgers, and therefore the wrong figures in the trial balance but still balancing. Compensating errors is where one error cancels out the other. So I might have two errors and one happens to cancel out the other. And complete reversal of entries is where I have put the amount on the wrong side of both accounts. So I've put the debit on the credit side and the credit on the debit side, and therefore the trial balance will still balance, but of course it's wrong. Now you'll also have errors that are revealed in the trial balance, and it might be just mathematical in that you have added something incorrectly or subtracted something incorrectly, of course, and it might also be a double entry error where you're missing one side of the entry, or misplaced entries where you've put something on the wrong side. Maybe you've done two credits instead of a debit and credit. And these errors are visible in the trial balance in that there will be a suspense account. So for example, in this next trial balance we see that the debit and credit don't match, so we include a suspense account on the debit side, the short side, and that brings the balance up. So the suspense goes in on the short side to make the trial balance balance, but it does mean that there are errors to be corrected. So as I said, the suspense account is included in the short side of the trial balance to make up the shortfall. We aim to clear the suspense balance clear of all errors. And some errors also then, while we correct them on the ledgers, they might also affect our net profit. So we might have to prepare a statement of corrected net profit as well. So we'll see that in our questions. So generally there are three steps that we use to correct our errors. First of all, we clearly identify what has happened. Then we identify what should have happened originally, and finally we combine the two to give us our correction. What is the journal entry to correct this error? Take a look there at 2018 May question 4, which was a full question on the errors, and basically you can read the detailed question there yourself. And the following errors were identified. So number 1 there, rent was paid of 5,000, was correctly entered in the bank account but was credited to the rates account. So to watch for the detail, the debits and credits and the actual accounts affected. So if we take a look at that one, first of all, to follow the three steps, number 1, you identify what has actually happened. So this was a payment of rent of 5,000. It didn't actually go through the rent account at all, and on the bank account it was correctly credited for 5,000, and on the rates account it was credited for 5,000. So what should have happened was the rent account should have been debited, The bank account is correct there at a credit of 5,000, and there should have been no entry in the rates account. So therefore, to move on to the third step, in order to correct that, my journal entry will be to debit the rent account as it should have been with 5,000. Don't do anything with the bank because that's correct as it is. I have to take out the rates entry, so I have to debit the rates entry of 5,000. Now in a journal entry, overall debits have to equal credits. So if I don't have any credits opposite that, therefore it must affect the suspense account. So the suspense account will be holding that 10,000, and now by crediting suspense, I'll balance my journal here and I'll take that 10,000 out of the suspense. And just on the journal entry, you always put a note at the end of a journal entry once you've it balanced and state what it was for. So this entry was for the correction of an error with rent and rates. Okay, so the next error question, part 2 we should say, goods purchased on credit for 15,000 were returned due to fault. Robert has still not received the refund for these goods. The return was recorded as below. So credit the purchase returns account 15,000 and debit the trade receivables account 15,000. So again, if we analyse that and we just look at what happened first of all, so we credited the purchase returns account 15,000 and we debited the trade receivables account 15,000. Now what should have happened with this, of course, is that the credit of the purchase returns account of 15,000 is correct, so that's fine, there's no change in that. But it shouldn't have affected the trade receivables at all. We're dealing with them for sales. This says purchases and purchase returns, so therefore it's the payables account that should have been affected. So it shouldn't have been receivables, so it should have been payables that was debited with the corresponding entry of 15,000. So that's what should have happened. And that brings us then to our third step to correct it in the journal. So the journal entry is to credit the trade receivables to take out that error of 15,000 and debit the payables like we should have done with 15,000. And therefore, because my debit and credit are both equal at 15,000, I don't have any suspense entry with this, and I just put a note underneath for that journal entry being the correction of an error with purchase returns. Okay, so moving on then to the third error here, we are told that electricity accrual at year end was recorded as follows: debit electricity accrual account 225, credit electricity expense account 225. And again, watch the debits and credits and the account names and figures and have a look then and analyse it. So if we look at what happened, we debited the electricity accrual 225 and credited the electricity expense 225. So you just write that out. And then what should have happened, just to clarify, we should have actually credited the electricity accrual 225. Remember, an accrual is a liability, it's always on the credit side, so that should have been credited. And the expense increasing there, we owed another 225, debit the electricity expense 225. So that's what should have happened. So combining the two gives us our correction and our journal entry. So to fix the accrual account, we have to credit the accrual with 225, but that'll simply cancel out the original error and it won't show the actual 225. So therefore we have to double the figure. So we credit the electricity accrual with 450. Likewise with the expense, to cancel out the error of 225 on the debit, on this credit there, we have to put it in on the debit. So just putting in 225 will simply cancel the error and won't show the entry. So therefore we have to double the figure. So we debit the electricity expense of 450. Now again here my debit and credit are matching, therefore I don't have any suspense affected here, and I simply put in a note underneath to explain what the correction is, so being the correction of an error with electricity accrual. Okay, so we're going to move on to part 4 here, and it tells us that new equipment costing 25,000 was purchased on the 1st of July. The equipment has a useful life of 5 years and no residual value. So Robert has a policy of charging a full year's depreciation in the year of purchase and none in the year of sale, and no entry has been made in the financial statements regarding this machine. So this is our favourite type of error, because if we take a look at it, the what happened section is actually blank. Nothing has happened, nothing has been recorded, and therefore we simply map out what should have happened, and that actually is our solution then as well. So what should have happened is, with the purchase of the equipment, we should have debited the equipment asset account, 25,000, and we should have credited the bank where the payment was made through for 25,000. And with regard to the depreciation, we should have debited the depreciation expense account for equipment, so debit there, and credit the accumulated depreciation, the minus to the fixed asset in the balance sheet of 5,000. And that then is our solution as well, so it's our journal entry. And again, you'll see debits and credits add up here to the same of 30,000 on either side, and it's a note underneath then to say it's a correction of an error with equipment purchase and depreciation. Okay, so as we move on to part 5, it tells us that rates prepaid at year end of 1,500 was recorded as follows. So debit the rates expense account 1,500 and credit the bank account 1,500. So again, just to analyse that, if we take a look at what happened, I simply restate it there: debit the rates expense account 1,500 and credit the bank account 1,500. Now, making a year-end adjustment for prepayment is nothing to do with the actual payment, so therefore it shouldn't have affected the bank account at all. The payment has already been recorded. We're simply adjusting the rates account for a prepayment. So the rates expense account should have been credited and thereby reduce the expense for the current year, because 1,500 belongs to next year, so we're taking that out. So we should have credited that, nothing through the bank account, and we should have shown then a prepayment asset account, rates prepaid 1,500 in the balance sheet. So to correct then, if we take the rates account, I have debited with 1,500, it should have been a credit of 1,500, so therefore I have to put in the credit and take out the original errors. So therefore I must credit now the rates expense account with 3,000, so I have to double up that figure. I have to also take out the entry that went into the bank account to correct that, so the bank account needs to be debited with the 1,500 to take that out, and I also need to show the asset of rates prepaid, debit the asset of 1,500 there, and a statement underneath then showing that this is the correction of an error with rates prepaid. Okay, so if we move on to part 6 of this question, it tells us that a customer who owed 500 at year end was incorrectly entered as 50 in the list of individual accounts in the receivables ledger. So this entry is a little bit unusual in that it was listed as 50 in the receivables ledger. Now, what it actually means here is that the list doesn't affect the trial balance or the books as such. The list is simply a cross-checking mechanism, and therefore there's no entry required to correct this. The account is actually correct with the 500, and that's what's posted, so there's no entry required for part 6. Okay, so part 7 of this question tells me that an increase of 3,100 in the allowance for receivables was not recorded in the general ledger. So again, this is one that's very easy to do because first of all, it wasn't recorded, so in terms of analysis nothing has happened. So you're straight on to what should have happened, and that's also your solution. So it should have been recorded as an expense, an increase in the allowance as an expense. So that would be debit the expense account 3,100, and we would be crediting the allowance for receivables in the balance sheet, which is a minus to the receivables in the current assets, so that's 3,100 there. And it's important to distinguish the names, that you wouldn't just call it allowance for receivables account on both, that one is an expense account in your income statement and the other one is distinguished as the account in the statement of financial position. So that's important for your marks. So what should have happened is actually your solution, your journal entry, and just a statement underneath that to explain that this is correction of an error of omission with the allowance for receivables. Okay, so when you have your workings done, the end result, of course, is journal entries. So you need to write up the journal. You'll be doing that as you go along, and it's simply the detail of the account and a debit and credit column, and write it up nice and neat. Generally put the debits first and then the credits and then the statement to explain the journal entry. Number your entries as you go along, and where, for example, in part 6 there was actually no entry to be made, just record that it is part 6 and that actually there's no entry required, just to show the examiner that you have addressed it. And that's it then, that's your journal complete. Okay, so the final part of the question, part B, is asking you to explain with examples the following types of errors. So that's just a little bit of theory where you explain the error and give examples, and there's 4 marks for that. So I'm not going to go through that, that's something I've done earlier in the video. But what I do want to talk about is another add-on sometimes you get with this question, where after doing the journal you might be asked to adjust the profit figure. So if I take the journal that I had created for part A, and we'll say, for example, I'm given a profit figure of 125,450. Basically, I can then go down through my journal that I've just done and identify items that will affect the statement of income. So, for example, rent and rates are expense accounts that would affect profit, and the rule is basically if it's a debit in the journal, then it'll be a minus to the profit. So here I would be minusing 5,000 for the rent, and the rates would be a minus 5,000 as well. The suspense account obviously doesn't go into your income statement, so you ignore that and you continue on down along. Receivables and payables are in the balance sheet and statement of financial position, so they don't affect profit either. And then I have electricity accrual, that's a liability account in the balance sheet. And the next one I have is the electricity expense. So the electric expense account, and that's a debit entry there of 450. So again, that's a minus of 450. Continuing down along, the equipment is an asset, bank is an asset, hopefully, and equipment depreciation is the next one that affects profit. And that was a debit of 5,000. And the accumulated depreciations in the balance sheet, so that doesn't affect my profit. Continuing down along, the rates expense, that expense account does affect profit, and this time it's a credit entry of 3,000. So I would be adding that to my income statement. And the bank is a debit, that's in the balance sheet, bank account, and rates prepaid is an asset in the balance sheet. Again, it doesn't affect profit. Part 6 had no entry, and part 7 we had the allowance expense and the allowance in the balance sheet. So the allowance expense of 3,100, that goes in here, the allowance expense, and again because it's a debit it's a minus 3,500 there. So that was all my entry, sorry, it's 3,100, I'll just correct that. So that was all the entries there, and therefore I can correct my profit figure. And so I'm just going to add these up. You can do this on your calculator and write up your answer. And my new adjusted profit figure then is there. Okay. Okay, so another little addition you can get sometimes with these questions is to clear the suspense account. So again, that's a part that's usually added on to the question after the journal entries. So you'll have your journal entries done, and in the journal entries you can simply scan down through them and identify the suspense account entries. Now in a question like this, usually you'll be given an opening balance for the suspense account. So we'll say, for example, in this question that the trial balance had a suspense on the debit side of 10,000, and we've gone through our errors and identified how to correct them, and we go down through our journal entries then, and we can see exactly where the suspense has to be adjusted. So the first entry there is actually the only one in this question. The suspense account has to be credited with 10,000. So you simply go to your suspense account then, and if it's a credit in the journal, then it's a credit entry in your suspense account, and simply identify the error number. In this case it's error 1, and it's 10,000. And if I go down through the journal entries, there wasn't actually any other suspense there. No, there's no other mention of suspense, and I can see then that my suspense account is actually zero balance if I balance that out, and I can close off the account. So the suspense account in that instance then is cleared off the trial balance, or trial balance will be clear.